Hello, and welcome to the Research Comms Podcast, a brand new series exploring the world of research communications in a digital age. My name is Peter Barker, and I'm a research communicator. I work with researchers and research organisations creating digital content to help disseminate their research and to encourage engagement around their work. And the reason I wanted to start this podcast was to inspire and inform people about the many ways in which the power of digital media can be harnessed to tell captivating research stories and to help generate real impact for research projects. The way I'll be doing that is through a series of interviews with some of the amazing people that I'm lucky enough to come into contact with through my work, all of whom are doing exciting, inventive, highly creative work in the field of research communications. So, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my first guest, hugely talented and prolific science communicator and science poet, Sam Illingworth. Sam was the first person I thought of when I decided to create this podcast, so I was very excited to have a chance to talk to him recently over the phone all about his work and to hear his advice for researchers who are looking to dive into the world of research communications. So, here it is. I hope you enjoy it. Hi Sam, thanks so much for agreeing to join me today. It's sort of almost hard to know where to start with the conversation because there's so many different things that you're involved with. Perhaps we could start by you just sort of giving us a bit of an overview about what it is that you do in terms of your various blogs and podcasts.
Yeah, of course. So my job title is Senior Lecturer in Science Communication at Manchester Metropolitan University. And I suppose any researcher really has any lecturer has three aspects to their work in that there's research, there's teaching, and then there should be an element of public engagement or outreach as well. I suppose the teaching is maybe the easiest. So I'm the programme leader for the MSc in Science Communication here at Manchester Metropolitan University. And this is a new programme which is offered to students who want to find out how to better communicate science to a variety of audiences using a range of media. In terms of research, my background is as an atmospheric physicist, but my current research now really looks at how is science communicated, and in particular choosing to focus on how we can start to engender dialogue better or more effectively between experts and non-experts. And one of the ways in which I do that is through poetry. And then that takes me on to my practice as well. So as well as researching and teaching science communication, I do a lot of science communication. So I host a lot of events, for example, for the Manchester Science Festival. I also perform poetry. So every week I write a science poem about a new piece of scientific research in a bid to communicate that to a wider audience. And I also perform poetry, science poetry, in poetry slams, in the Edinburgh Fringe. And I also use poetry in my teaching as well. So poetry is really the link
pretty important
between everything, yeah.
But in addition to that as well, you've got the podcast, right?
Neutrinos the Neutrinos Are Mutating, which is a podcast that we run at Manchester Met, in which every month we talk to a new academic or an academic about a science fiction film that they love or hate, and then pull apart the science facts behind science fiction. That's available at tnampodcast.com. I'm also involved in a blog with my colleague Sophie Powell, who is an amazing, now just finished a PhD at the University of Manchester. She's also a beauty blogger under Scientific Beauty. And we have a blog called Sartorial Science, in which we encourage researchers to send in photos of themselves looking not dapper, because I think Sophie and I were both just a bit cross at the stereotyping of scientists as being these really awful-looking, poorly dressed people,
Sure.
Whereas Sophie and myself, Sophie especially, are fairly resplendent, I think, in the way that it turned out. And it was a bit of fun, but also it points to a more serious message in that scientists do come in all shapes, sizes, colours, genders, and this kind of project's necessary really to break that down and to demonstrate to future scientists that you don't have to be an old white man in a lab coat.
Yeah.
and gases in order to be a really successful scientist.
So who are you aiming these science communications efforts at? Who's reading the blogs and listening to the podcasts and so on?
Audience, in my opinion, is the most important thing driving through most of the activities that I do. And I try to think about the audience before I do a particular activity. So, for example, the podcast, that was always going to be aimed at a more general audience. And the statistics and figures on the back end of WordPress, which we used to host it, do back that up, that, it has a really quite varied listenership across the world.
Right.
It's, one of the few things that my lovely friends who don't really know what I do outside of science listen to and enjoy. In terms of the poetry, it's interesting really because poetry to some extent has similar issues with science in that it can be seen to be very inaccessible and be something that is maybe less so now, but the preserve of white middle class men. There is certainly an extent of when I work with school children or when I work with people from maybe disadvantaged backgrounds of this concept that, poetry's not for me and science isn't for me. And in my opinion, science really at its most fundamental concept is just about asking questions. That's what science is. And I think if you can empower people to ask questions about sciencey things, like why is the sky blue? How does my television work? What is my center of balance? All these questions. Then you're able to then encourage and empower them to be able to ask questions of the wider society. Why am I being treated differently because of my background, because of my race, because of my color, because of my gender, etc.? And I think that science really does have that capability that is sometimes taken for granted by the people that practice it. And part of the poetry was to showcase to people, look, isn't this science just amazing? Like, aren't these stories actually amazing? Like, not only do they have societal benefit, but isn't it just interesting? And the same with poetry. I am not by any means a great poet, but that doesn't mean that anybody can't write poetry and have fun doing so and learn key skills, how to express yourself, how to challenge. And I think that for me is where poetry and science have these things in common. They're both ways of looking at the world that are not necessarily mutually exclusive and which ultimately can empower the people that are doing them. But it's up to us as scientists and poets to make people aware that it isn't a closed group and that anyone can do it and everybody should do it.
Is there something recent perhaps that you've written that you would be willing to give us a read of?
Yeah, of course. I'll read you one of the poems. I'll explain a little bit about the research first, and then I'll tell you a quite interesting story that's come from this actually, which builds on what we've been talking about. So yeah, every week I try and read a poem from a new area of research, often outside my own sphere of expertise, and then try to summarize it in a poem. Yeah. And I try to pick a poetic format that is reflective of the research. So, for example, the poem I'm going to read now is a Kyrielle, which means that it has the last line of every verse always repeating. So it sounds a bit like a bell. So there's like a constant call to arms, basically. And this is based on a piece of research that was done by researchers in Canada that was looking at a tracer for measuring urine in swimming pools. Right. What they found was that basically if they used this artificial sweetener called ace-sulfame potassium, or ACE, it's a really good tracer for urine because it doesn't occur naturally, it's widely consumed, it's chemically stable, and it's completely excreted by humans in their urine. Right. So what that means is that if you find it in a pool, the only way it could possibly have been there is because a human has excreted it. Okay. Yeah. And rather distressingly, across 31 pools in 2 Canadian cities, they found ACE in every single measured sample. So this is called a piscine problem. Urea, that's contained in wee, plus chlorine gives us DBP. This makes our eyes stream like a fool. Please do not piss into the pool. Deciding how much P is there can be quite a complex affair. What's needed is a special tool. Please do not piss into the pool. The sweetener that is called ACE can measure wee-wee with a trace. ACE equals urine is the rule. Please do not piss into the pool. Researchers found that ACE exists in every pool they made their lists. Whilst not as bad as a fresh stool, please do not piss into the pool. When swimming next, please do take care and try to swallow only air. We should all be taught this in school. Please do not piss into the pool.
Love it.
So,
that's brilliant.
Thanks. Slight expletives in there, so apologies for that.
Fine. It's just really great to hear you reciting one of your poems. Thanks very much, after having read so many of them. And now, in terms of the purpose of what you do, aside from shining a light on interesting research findings, what is it that you hope to achieve by combining science with poetry in this way?
I think what really interests me is not the poetry of science or the art of science or the science of art, but what interests me is how these different fields can be used in an interdisciplinary manner to bring things together. You know, it harks back to C.P. Snow in the 1950s with his Reed lecture of the two cultures, in which he says that there's global interdisciplinary problems can only be solved by interdisciplinary solutions. So things such as the poverty gap, climate change, these are not things that can be solved by scientists. These are things that everybody needs to be involved with. And I think, you know, I wrote about this recently for the British Science Association, that part of the problem is that scientists become separate from communities. And it's very easy to forget that scientists themselves are also affected by these problems. You know, scientists researching cancer can still be affected by cancer. Scientists researching climate change are still affected by climate change. And it's really important to work to demonstrate that scientists are part of those communities. And you know, one of the ways that can be done is through the consideration of where art fits into that practice and the relationship between the two. Absolutely.
So my focus and the focus of this podcast is to explore, you know, how researchers can harness the power of digital tools in particular to communicate their research and to engage with the public more effectively. So my question is, how important do you feel digital media is for researchers who are looking to increase the reach of their communications efforts and to really engage with people in a meaningful way?
I think that's a really good question. So my colleague James Redfern and Joanna Varan and I published a paper on this last year. You can check it out in F1000 Research. And it's basically, what we did was we looked at different ways in which the general public get their science. So where do they get their science from? And you know, the vast majority is unsurprisingly digital. So what that tells us is, why are scientists and science communicators and public engagement experts not focusing more on the digital?
Right.
And, you know, there's absolutely a place for large-scale science events for people to get hands-on, etc. 100% a place for that. But when the vast majority of people get their science through blogs, through the internet, through podcasts, through online media, through the BBC and through YouTube, why are we as science communicators not focusing more on that? And I think that is a very interesting question. I think a lot of science communication experts and practitioners are moving towards that route. But I think that we could be putting even more focus on that, and that could be driven from an institutional level.
Yeah.
Just logistically, it makes sense.
Yeah.
If you think about how much time and effort it takes to plan an event for 300 people to come to your institute, it's a lot. Whereas if you think about the resources that it takes to put together an online package that could potentially be downloaded by 300,000 people, they're not a million miles apart.
Sure.
And it's just, you know, developing that skill set, thinking about those questions and asking. I mean, my biggest bugbear really is that we, as science communicators as well, we have this thing of we're good at, we can be innovative in terms of how we communicate research, how we communicate engagement, but sometimes we don't actually ask what topics want to be communicated. We just assume that audiences want to hear about this because it's important. And I think that if we just asked, that would be much more important. So, asking what topic, what media, what format they wanted it to take would go a long way.
Yeah. So what advice do you have for researchers and communicators, research communicators, who recognize how powerful digital media can be to get the message out there, but who are perhaps somewhat daunted by the prospect of getting involved in the digital world, bearing in mind there are so many different platforms and so many different formats to choose from?
So I think the best thing to do, and this is difficult and it requires time, but it's to build communities.
Yeah.
So it's rather than just dumping post after post after post. It's commenting on other people's blogs. It's really starting to build a community. And I think you raise a really interesting point, Peter, when you talk about it is daunting. And it is daunting, It is unreasonable, really, to expect researchers and academics to have the skill sets of being an exceptional researcher, an exceptional teacher, an exceptional administrator. Oh, and also, can you please excel at every single digital format that ever existed?
Yeah.
It's completely unreasonable. But that is why there are experts in this thing, and this is why people such as yourself are available to go to for help, which is why a lot of institutes have public engagement experts and specialists, so that, if someone wanted to come to me and said, I've got this idea for a vlog or a blog or a podcast, I'd be able to sit down with them, talk them through the steps. And I think also it's important not to lose heart. Things just take time to build. My poetry blog, I think, is relatively successful now. I have about 2,000 reads a month, which is quite good.
Yeah.
But, that started off with 10, 20 reads a month. And it was only through building that up, by engaging with the communities, by promoting it constantly, by also finding my voice, that it was able to build to where it is now. And there's still a long way to go. Yeah,
absolutely. Patience, I agree, is key when it comes to building an engaged community, whether that's amongst the public or fellow researchers, policymakers, whoever it is you're trying to reach. So, Sam, thank you so much. I think I've taken up enough of your time today. I'd love to finish, if you don't mind, by hearing your 3 top takeaways based on our conversation today for listeners who are looking to boost their own research communication efforts. So perhaps they've started or are thinking of starting a blog or a podcast, whatever it might be.
Absolutely. So I think the first thing is, don't be overwhelmed, and don't feel as though you have to have all of the skill sets and that you have to master every single digital tool that's out there. So I say this quite a lot, but it's about tipping your digital toe in the environment and working out which platform works for you. So, for example, I know that Twitter works very well for me, whereas at a professional level, Facebook doesn't work so well. Mm-hmm. But, I've tried almost every social media platform in some degree or other, or at least investigated it. And it's about finding which one works for you, which one or two work for you, and then really focusing your energies on those, I think. And that will help you to build that. It'll help you to build a community and also help it to be less overwhelming. I think the second thing is to be flexible. Not everything will work out as you've planned, but just roll with it and don't get frustrated, and realize that if you've planned something, then if you've planned it well enough, you should be able to cope with every eventuality. And in particular, these is like, for example, if nobody turns up to an event, or if there's a very small number of people at an event, don't get too upset about it, because even if one person turns up, you might be having a positive impact on that one person's life.
Yeah.
In ways you can't tell. And then finally, just to listen. I think this is the most important skill in life, not just in science communication, teaching, but just in life. If you just listen to what other people say, it can really help you to better understand their worldview, and in turn, it can help you to develop your own as well.
Brilliant. That's lovely. Thank you so much. It's been very entertaining. A real pleasure to speak to you. I hope people have enjoyed listening. I'm sure they have, and looking forward to seeing more of your work.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. So there we have it. That was my conversation with Sam Illingworth, which I had a few weeks ago. You can check out all of Sam's various endeavours. That's his poetry, his podcast, the Sartorial Science blog on his website, which is samillingworth.com. And if you want to reach out to him, you can tweet him at Sam Illingworth. If you're still listening, thanks very much for joining me all the way to the end of this first episode, and do stay tuned for the next episode, when I'll be chatting about the power of the podcast as a tool for communicating research with Emily Elias, who's a talented producer and presenter behind the excellent Oxford Sparks Big Questions podcast series. So until then, thanks and goodbye.